This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So what my paper hopes to do today is to address a methodological imbalance which I believe has emerged in the study of the early modern British Empire and especially with the British in Asia. So the study of networks and the adoption of network active theory has been one of the main methodological developments of the rise of global history in the past 2 decades. Its advantages for the study of the British Empire have been highlighted by a number of eminent historians, including Natasha Glaser, Alan Lester, and in particular Stephen Howe in his review of future approaches in the field in his article British Worlds, Settler Worlds, World Systems and Killing Fields, which was published last year in the Journal of Imperial and World History. In fact, the use of networks, as I'm sure you're all well aware, in the study of the British Empire is so well established there's really little need for me to rehash its advantages or its rise in the study of the British Empire here today. What I want to do today, however, is to address the unevenness of its application by historians of the early modern British Empire. So for Atlantic historians, networks have widely been adopted for understanding the movement of and relationship between people, goods and ideas around that particular oceanic basin. Now this is stemmed in part from the desire of Atlantic historians to globalise the process of British interaction with the various regions of the Atlantic, a pursuit which has led them to draw on the Americas, Europe and Africa to conceive of an Atlantic world, and that term is obviously well established in the historiography now. Furthermore, there's a growing body of research which connects the Atlantic oceanic basin with the wider world, especially with Asia. Through the work of historians such as Alison Gaines and Lauren Benton, the result is a truly global dimension to the Atlantic. Well, of course, this is a positive development, and I'm sure some of you might take me to task with this a bit later. Nonetheless, the reluctance of historians of British Asia in the early modern period, and more specifically of the English East India Company, to adopt network methodology for the early modern period threatens to create a global framework for the British Empire, which transforms understanding of the British in Asia without historians of British Asia. Pretty bold statement. Indeed, most histories of the British in Asia which adopt network methodology are largely confined to the 19th and 20th centuries. And this is particularly frustrating in the light of the breadth of work which has been published on non-British networks in early modern Asia, such as those of Jewish, Farsi, Armenian, Dutch and Indian merchant and imperial agents. But as Anna Winterbottom has recently observed, network theory has a lot to teach us about the East India Company, especially in its early history. So what I want to do today is to argue that there is an opportunity for historians of the English East India Company to utilise the missed opportunities of network theory by engaging in a similarly emerging field in British imperial studies, the family. Now, the importance of the family to the British state and society in the early modern period is obviously well established as well by historians, too many to mention a few: Keith Wrightson, Catherine Hall and Margaret Hunt. The Atlantic as well is seen as a space of families, settlement and migration, and as Phil Stern has noted, Asia remains strictly seen as a space of commerce and companies. But Margot Finn has recently highlighted the importance of kin relations operating within Asia in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, demonstrating how exchange and consumption of material goods between kin could help create family-centric economies and fortunes. For Finn, the socio-economic causes of imperial expansion are found uniquely in these kin relations. According to Kathleen Wilson as well, the family is beginning to be perceived as an intermediary agent, acting as a go-between in relation to the company and its colonial subjects in Asia. So, through the use of network theory, I will argue today that the family was vitally important to the formation of a homogeneous company Asian world in the early modern period. Far from being just a space of commerce and companies, Asia in the early modern period saw the spread of English and British kinship networks which connected the company's disparate settlements and settlements together, binding them into a more global Asian world. I will hope by these insights to create connections with the Atlantic and contribute to bringing the study of British Asia more in line with approaches used to study, in the words of Hugh Bowie, and other worlds of Britain's oceanic empire. Let's see if I do any of that. So in Asia, family shaped how the English lived, socialised, interacted, travelled, traded, governed and died. In 1681, Sir Jose Child, the political economist and chairman of the Court of Directors, described the English living in the areas of the company's charter in Asia as consisting of, quote, many hundreds of families. In perceiving the English in Asia as a series of families, Child revealed the central role played by the latter in lives of company servants, long after they departed hearth and home in England. Now, this situation was facilitated in a number of ways. The key one, perhaps, was the hereditary recruitment pattern of the company, who preferred to recruit their factors, agents and merchants from families of existing members, believing it to be perhaps the most reliable vetting process. For a very quick example, the siblings Christopher and George Oxenden went out to Asia in the company service in the 1640s with their father. When George Oxenden returned in 1661 as governor of Bombay, he brought with him his nephew Strainton Master, who went on to be governor of Madras. When in Asia, the company servants depended on family both there and back at home for everything beyond what their meagre wages allowed. This financial, material and emotional dependence ensured that the familial ties attaching far-flung kin to their family home endured and grew even more prominent with time. For example, when the brothers John and Joseph Walsh were sent out to Asia in 1714 through the patronage of their uncle, the Madras councillor John Styliman, they depended on their kin for absolutely everything. Joseph was stationed at Bencoolen on the island of Sumatra, and he was supplied by his kin at Madras for even the most basic of sustenance. For example, he regularly sent a shopping list of food to his aunt at Fort St. George, while his uncle supplied him with more luxurious European articles such as the head of a cane, and another uncle sent him the latest in European footwear. Even financial dependence, if it happened at all, which it often didn't due to death from the climate or disease or even the risks of trading in Asia full stop, still did not mean the loosening of familial ties or independence from the family. For the dynamic worked retrospectively as well. As siblings, sons, nephews and cousins were sent out to Asia through the support and connection of their family, they were expected to relieve the often impoverished fortunes of the latter. Joseph Colate accepted the post as Deputy Governor of the west coast of Sumatra after he went bankrupt in 1710. At first he depended on his family for everything, including money to outfit a ship to reach Asia, ransom money when he was captured by the French in Brazil, and articles to maintain his station as a governor in Asia. So his family sent him on a regular basis hats, leather shoes, vinegar, spectacles, silk stockings and Virginia tobacco. By 1716, however, he was earning the considerable sum of £2,000 a year, although many speculated it to be about 5 times as much. So he was able to send home cash remittances in the form of allowances for his daughters, dowries for his mother and pensions for his brothers and nephews. As Colette wrote in a letter to the governor of Madras, quote, "The profits of my government maintain my family in England. The interests of parents and children are so closely united, and distance of time or place ought to be no obstruction." So through the combination of the hereditary recruitment pattern of the company and the interdependence created by financial and material necessity, ensured that once company servants were in Asia, they operated within a familial context as much as their countrymen in the Atlantic. Nonetheless, in contrast to England, the amplified factors of distance and time separating kin, both between Europe and Asia and within Asia itself, did change the fundamental dynamic of interaction between them. In England, a person's familial world was geographically much smaller and far more immediate. A quantitative analysis undertaken of the daily social interactions of Samuel Pepys in London, for example, show a fifth of these interactions to have been with kin. But more importantly, the majority took place in London itself, while the furthest took place no farther than Cambridge. The sheer size of the company servants' world in Asia, however, made such local and frequent kin interaction nigh impossible. As Sir Hosea Child explained, it was, quote, much more difficult to maintain a correspondence in India from port to port by reason of the set monsoons or trade winds that blow 6 months together one way. And as the historian Richard Drayton has observed, Europeans in Asia were forced to, quote, cooperate with natural flows of energy and natural resistance, end quote, living, working and existing across disparate coastal enclaves and maritime spaces. The result then was the creation of networks of exchange, communication and movement which connected disparate kin right across Asia. And what I'd like to do very briefly is to reconstruct one of these kinship networks. So John Scattergood was born and bred in the company's service in India. His father was stationed at Balasore on the Bay of Bengal as a councillor, where John was born in 1681. His father died shortly thereafter, and his mother remarried another Balasore councillor, Richard Trenchfield, providing John with 2 half-sisters and 2 half-brothers. He entered the service as a supercargo, a captain of ships, trading to China in 1700. By this time, his family expanded to create a sizable kinship network in Madras, of which half a dozen at least were involved in John's day-to-day life. At his death in 1723, his kin had spread out right across Asia to establish themselves in most of the company's main ports and along its main maritime highways to create a vast network of exchange and circulation. Now, the arrival of John's brother Jack, and I apologise for all these John Jack names, and they'll get a bit more in a minute, embodies the dynamic of such kinship networks in Asia. John's other brother, Eli, a free merchant stationed at Madras, wrote to him of their younger brother's arrival in Asia, informing him that, quote, "When my brother Jack arrived, he delivered me 600 rupees on account of your daughter Carolina, which, according to your desire, have invested in my voyage this season." According to their sister Elizabeth, who wrote them soon after Jack's arrival, their young sibling had left their hometown in Lincoln for Asia due to a depression in trade and the political disturbances caused by the Pretender, who had, quote, "landed in Scotland, God only knows when this trouble will be put to an end." News was particularly welcomed by those in Asia, and Eli wrote in reply asking his sister for, quote, "all news foreign and domestic, especially in the last of our own family. I desire all the newspapers and pamphlets you think worth my reading." Jack's brothers offered him the chance of employment and potentially the creation of a fortune, especially as he had a vast inheritance to invest. As Eli informed John, "I designed before leaving India to fix Jack in a good employment. I don't know of a young man in India that has a better prospect of himself than himself." In return, Jack brought familial finance from himself and John's niece, knowledge of European trade and politics, and letters from family and kin based both in Lincoln and London. So the exchange and movement of people, knowledge, finance and good across John's kinship network cemented links between the various nodes of the network and maintained relationships between participating families all across Asia. The commercial relationship between John Scattergood and his cousin Bernard Wyke is a good example of this. The link was an important one for the wider trading fortunes and ambitions of the family in India. Wyke was chief of Surat, a port on the west coast of India, employing his younger brother and his cousin John Scattergood as supercargo of the port's lucrative ships trading to Amity in China. Wyke also protected the kinship network's trading interests further down the coast, where it was run by their cousin Charles Burneston. The importance of the Wyke connection within the network was considerable, and John Scattergood was aware of the need to consistently strengthen the ties between them. One way this was done was by extending hospitality to Bernard Wyke's family. For example, in 1714, one typical visit was when John and his wife Arabella invited the Wyke children to stay with them at Madras, along with the Phipps family as well, William Phipp being a member of Bernard Wyke's council at Surat and also cousins of the Scattergood. Such movement and circulation of kin members to the various nodes of the network ensured the continuance of relationships of trust and mutual interest. John's kinship network was by far the largest operating in Asia of its kind in the early 18th century. And a good example of this is when John conducted a voyage to China on his ship the Amity, coordinating investments from all of the network's main centres and nodes. Of the eventual 180,000 rupees subscribed, just less than half came from within the network. John Scattergood as supercargo, William Aislabie as governor of Bombay, and Bernard Wyke as chief of Surat committed the largest sums and also represent more or less the most important and prominent families within John Scattergood's network. But there were other families as well, some more prominent, some less so. While the Scattergoods, Aislabies and Wykes were based at the network's main nodes, the Trenchfields existed in the oceanic spaces in between, acting as supercargoes and free merchants, plying the company's maritime highways which connected the network, arranging transactions at places such as Tellicherry, Mocha and Canton in China. There were also the Burnestons at Bombay, the brothers Samuel and John of whom served as deputy governors under their cousin, William Aislabie. Less significant links within the network range from the brothers Thomas and Christopher Dixon, who operated in the Bay of Bengal, right down to a single relation such as Thomas Paine, cousin of the Trenchfields, and who accompanied Eli and Jack on their voyages around the Indian Ocean. But regardless of size or distinction, these families mentioned formed a vast network of mutually beneficial exchange and interest based on ties of the family. Now, the ability for private networks to create homogeneous political regions has been well established. In the Atlantic, for example, David Hancock, a very well-known example, showed how a network of British associates in the 18th century led to the integration of an Atlantic community, which facilitated British imperial expansion there. I would argue that the formation and spread of British kinship networks in Asia provided the company with invaluable private infrastructure through which it could govern its state. In fact, if the state can be defined, according to Michael Babbitt, as a network of agents operating beyond the centre, then it's possible to argue that the company's kinship networks were able to exercise political agency within that state and shape it accordingly. So what I want to do in the remaining few minutes is to reveal the political role of these networks by adopting Patrick Joyce's perspective and present the company state, quote, not as a thing, but as something like a site of passage of and between different powers, or in other words, in terms of relationships. Kinship networks open up channels of intelligence, knowledge, information, contact, and even loyalty, all of which could be and were tapped regularly by the company to facilitate its control and regulation over settlements and subjects in Asia. The company used these to bind its state closer together, maintain its legal jurisdiction, and exercise its political sovereignty. The threat posed by interlopers and a rival new company at the end of the 17th century highlights the political agency of kinship networks in Asia. And for the last 5 minutes, I just want to focus on that. In 1698, a consortium of merchants and politicians succeeded in gaining a charter for the creation of a new East India Company, in exchange for a hefty £2 million loan to the Crown. The new company immediately dispatched consuls to represent it at each of the old East India Company's main settlements in India, Surat, Bengal and Madras. At Surat and Bengal, the interaction between the companies was marked by rivalry and conflict, some of it quite violent. But at Madras, the consul for the new East India Company, John Pitt, and the governor for the old East India Company, Thomas Pitt, were linked and bound into the same kinship network, and as such their private connection shaped their public roles. During the 1680s and 1690s, the Pitt kinship network included more than half a dozen members, some in the service of the East India Company, like John Pitt, some not, like his cousin Thomas Pitt, who, before becoming governor of Madras, was actually perhaps the most infamous interloper operating in Asia, trading directly with the Mughal Empire in defiance of the company's charter there. Kinship ties connected Pitt serving the company with their illegal counterparts, and a network spread between them throughout Asia, circulating capital, knowledge and opportunity. For example, Thomas Pitt was the main creditor and trading partner of his cousin John Pitt, and also responsible for his nomination as chief of Persia. John, and we're going to get a bit complicated here, was also godfather of his cousin's son, Robert Pitt, a supercargo on ships trading to China. He was also beneficiary of his godfather's will, and his father was an executor of his cousin's will. All these reciprocating ties, as complicated as they become, deepen integrating members into the network. And although relations between members later became strained on the emergence of the new East India Company, their participation in the same network shaped the interaction of the two companies in the period 1699 to 1703. And in 1699, John Pitt arrived at Madras as consul for the new East India Company, with a commission to take over the government of Madras from his cousin, the governor Thomas Pitt. John wrote to Thomas invoking kin ties and familial bonds, reminding him of, quote, the great obligations I have to you, and from whose converse I propose myself very great advantage in carrying on my master's interests. John hoped to deal with the takeover of Madras in a sensitive manner, so as not to hurt his cousin's pride, declaring, I would not injure my kinsman the governor. So he suggested the handover ceremony in secrecy beyond the walls of Madras. Although Thomas Pitt rejected his cousin's commission and the legitimacy of the new East India Company, refusing to hand over Madras, their interaction remained shaped by their inclusion in a wider kinship network, discussing each other's families, their relations, their wives, their daughters, ending their letters, your affectionate kinsman. Their familial dialogue transcended corporate loyalties and provided channels of communication and interaction absent from the destructive rivalry at Surat and Bengal. While both had public corporate duties to perform which put them at conflict with one another, their private connection allowed them to navigate these differences. After one long letter rebuffing Jonathan Pitt's argument about the legality of the new company, Thomas Pitt concluded, I have now answered all your riff-raff stuff, which I hope will be as tiresome to you to read as it was to me to write. He then went on to discuss the purchase of horses, the gifts of 10 chests of Persian wine for his cousin, and other trading interests their network had. Whatever their differences, their affairs of the wider kinship network was constantly drawn on to reconcile them. They discussed other members, exchanged news and latest developments within the network. In one letter, Thomas Pitt wrote to his cousin to discuss appointment of his son Robert as supercargo on ships trading to China, to discuss his own health, and to ask, quote, if your more weighty business will permit, I shall be glad to hear what has become of our relations. Is George Pitt married or about it? The wider kinship was drawn on to connect the apparently divided companies on the Coromandel coast. Both governor and consul corresponded with the same kin members on a regular basis. For example, both had written to their cousin, another Jonathan Pitt, offering his son employment with their respective companies. While that particular cousin ended up serving his namesake in the new company, the son of another cousin went out to serve the old company under Thomas Pitt, and on occasion these young kin members would move between the two. The exchange of goods, knowledge and family between the two supposed rivals led to Sir William Norris, ambassador to the Mughal Empire for the new company, reporting to his masters in London that Consul Pitt, quote, acted more for the old company's interest than ours. In fact, the consul's lack of progress in supplanting his cousin's authority on the coast contributed to the announcement of a merger between the two rival companies in 1702, although actually it was more like an absorption of the new company by the old, best perhaps represented by the fact that Jonathan Pitt was made his cousin Thomas Pitt's deputy. Coincidentally, the use of kinship networks to shape public events in their favour was a strategy originally conceived by the new company, who, the old company reported to Thomas Pitt, quote, by their sending Mr. Jonathan Pitt, your kinsman, to be their agent on the coast, they expect will influence affairs in their favour. So, to conclude, with their ability to cross public and private boundaries as well as link company with contested spaces of jurisdiction, kinship networks proved adept at binding the company's expanding and disparate world closer together at the turn of the 18th century. This spread and consolidation laid the foundation of a distinct and homogeneous company Asian world, in which far-flung settlements, ports and factories were connected through the private networks of their servants. Speaking of the late 19th and early 20th century British Empire, Andrew Thompson has argued that the study of networks, though still in many ways in its infancy, is already helping us to see the empire more clearly for what it really was, an interconnected zone constituted by multiple points of contact and complex circuits of exchange. I have argued today, hopefully, that this was also the case for the early modern British Empire in Asia. Sir Hosea Child described England's global maritime agents as inhabitants of the universe, a term I believe most fitting for the members of these kinship networks which spread out across Asia in the early modern period. Instead of being divided by the oceans through which they moved, families were connected by them. Bound by ties of blood and marriage, they operated within a global Asian world defined by exchange and shaped by connections across time and space.